Every single deck in the meta can play some combination of staple cards, and when a new ban list drops, it's more important than ever to know which ones are the best ones to put in your deck. So if you're looking for that kind of content, then you've come to the right place. What's up guys, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going over what I personally feel are the 30 most commonly played staple cards, or that will be played in the 2023 September format. Just as a heads up, this is my opinion and my opinion only, so you can feel free to disagree about how good I think these cards are. But also, I can't possibly cover every staple card out there. I just picked what I personally felt would be the 30 most relevant or talked about staple cards. So with all that being said, let's just hop straight into it. So just quickly going over the tiers first. So strong main deck option, these are cards I think that definitely should be in your main deck if your deck can handle it. Strong side deck option, I think most, if not all decks, should be siding these cards, or unless they have a very good reason not to. Next up is niche side deck option. So these are cards that hit only a very certain specific type of deck or combination of decks out there, and it really depends on your specific deck or how the meta shifts at your local area. And finally, cards that are not good. I just think that these cards just aren't worth it. No matter what, they probably shouldn't really be played in this format at all. So hopping straight into it, the first one being Dark Ruler No More. So Dark Ruler No More didn't really see much play last format, and I don't think it'll see much play this format either. It only really hits a select few decks out there, so like the combo decks like Infernoble can hit Manadium, but Manadium has a counter trap to negate it. Just really doesn't have that good of coverage right now. Maybe it can hit like Sprite variants, but that's probably about it off the top of my head. I personally would just put this as a niche side deck option near the bottom. Almost borderline like not good this format. I don't think there are too many decks that actually die to this card. It doesn't really do anything to top decks like Unchained and Pearly. So for that reason, I think there are just a lot better options out there. Next up is Ash Blossom and Joy Spring. So Ash Blossom was okay last format. I think it's pretty solid this format just because of, once again, how open the format is. This format, I think a lot of different decks are viable out there, and Ash just being able to be a safe pick into every single one of them, because every single deck at least has something you can Ash. Whether or not it's high impact or not is left to be said. But Ash Blossom, just because of how generic it is and how much coverage it offers you, I think is definitely a strong main deck option you can consider putting into your main deck, just because you don't really know what you're going to run into no matter what tournament you go to, and just having coverage for everything in your main deck is pretty solid. Next up is Harpy's Feather Duster. This has historically always been a very strong side deck option, and I don't think that's going to change this format. You can pretty much side this against every deck, even a deck like Unchained or Pearly. Like against Pearly, they might end up playing books and stuff. You can hit away all their follow-up spells and stuff. Against Unchained, even hitting their back row isn't like the worst thing in the world. They could float into things, sure, but the things they float into usually will offer less disruption than their actual like traps themselves if they had just been able to keep them. Especially with the prevalence of Triple Tactics Thrust, I think this is a very strong side deck option, maybe even borderline main deck if you're playing Thrust, but otherwise, like, I definitely think this should be in everyone's side deck no matter what deck you're playing. On a similar vein, I think Change of Heart and Mind Control, like these two stealing cards specifically, are also very strong this format. They're very good against Unchained, which is most likely going to be the top deck of the format, and the fact is you're able to hit so many different decks with it. At worst, it's always going to be a 1-for-1 trade because it can force your opponent's interruption out. At best, you're able to get a lot more value by stealing something, for example, like Nightmare Griffin, which can be very difficult for your opponent to start outing their own cards, or DDD Wave King High Caesar. That can be very good to stop some of the Unchained cards as well. I think this is a very strong side deck option. I wouldn't main deck this because it doesn't have any applications going first. Definitely very strong side deck options that most decks should be playing. Next up is DD Crow, and DD Crow is an interesting one because it's never really the highest impact, but it's also like Ash Blossom, it has a lot of coverage. It can hit a lot of the decks out there, and at least will do something into all of them. So I think if you aren't really too sure what you could put in your side deck to specifically hit certain decks, or you can't play certain hate cards, I think DD Crow could be a safe option because it hits a lot of the decks out there. For example, considering Unchained, you can hit Shiyama, the blue dog level 6. That can be pretty solid. You can also hit their Yama target when they destroy something. You can also hit like Pearly, like when they use Pearlily effect. The list just goes on and on. Like I mentioned, it's never really super high impact, but I think that the fact that it has a lot of coverage, I would put it like at the very bottom of strong side deck option. You don't really have anything else you can side in, or like some of these cards conflict with your engine, then definitely you can try considering DD Crow, and I think it'd be a solid choice. Next up is Dark Hole, and Raigeki in a similar vein, but mostly Dark Hole. People would agree Dark Hole is better in a lot of senses because of a card like Ibli. Just being able to remove it from your own board can be huge, but also at the same time, if you're playing a deck like Unchained that benefits from destroying your own monsters, you could potentially play Dark Hole as well to destroy your own monsters, and it could come up. Do I think Dark Hole is a good removal card though? Against the Unchained deck, it's very like mid. They can easily get stuff back with Yama, and yes, they do lose something at the end, but I don't know if it's really worth it against them because you're going to still need other cards to play through their board. Doesn't do anything against Pearly, doesn't do anything against like Labyrinth, is pretty bad against Branded. So I think like it's a very niche side deck option. If your deck has a very big problem with Ibli, you can consider playing it, or if your local area is full of decks that would lose to board breakers like this, then you can consider playing it, but I'm not so sure that like Dark Hole, Raigeki are particularly great side deck options this format. Next up is Contact C. So Contact C is an interesting spot. It was initially very good against Kashtira. That's one of the best decks to play it against, but now that Kashtira is sort of out of the format, there isn't really too many other decks you can hit with this. You can't really hit Unchained with it. They have a generic link too. Pearlies have been playing IP Masquerena recently to out this. Maybe it has some applications against like Branded Despia, but aside from that, I can't really think of too many other decks where this is an insanely good card. I suppose it can hit like the mono Cybers decks like Marincess and Salamangrate, but those are more like roguish decks anyways that you won't be seeing too often, so I think I'm gonna have to put this in the not good category. I could be missing a very popular deck, but off the top of my head, I don't think this card is very good, and I don't think you should really be siding at this format. Next up is Dimension Shifter. Now, Dimension Shifter, of course, did not get hit, unfortunately, and this card is still one of the most oppressive cards in the game. So many decks rely on their graveyard, and even if there isn't a big reliance, a lot of decks use the graveyard as an extra resource, and just cutting that off completely can just honestly end someone's turn on their own. I would definitely put this in like strong main deck option if you can actually play it in your deck. I know like most decks actually cannot play this card, but if you're on a deck that can actually play Dimension Shifter, I'm fairly confident it should be in your main deck, considering Kashtira was with the one like bad matchup for Dimension Shifter that you would run into, and one of the main reasons you wouldn't want a main deck hit. But now that it's gone, I definitely do think main decking Shifter is the play if you're able to in your deck. Next up are the Kaijus. So Kaijus are interesting because you can argue they functionally work this in a similar way as Change of Heart, but have a little bit more coverage because they're going to hit like the Expertly Nora Towers. And I think that's sort of where I stand with this card. I do think these are decent, and they sort of fulfill a similar role as Change of Heart in most scenarios, but the fact that it can hit Pearly is pretty strong, I think, because Change of Heart and Mind Control actually don't do anything to Pearly, whereas like Kaiju would be able to. Now, on the other hand, if you do play against a deck like Unchained, Kaijus can be okay, I suppose. You don't destroy anything, which is nice, which will also force your opponent to be able to commit more resources back onto the board if they want to reestablish their board. Aside from that, I think just being an okay trade into a lot of the decks out there makes the Kaijus like a pretty decent main side deck option. I put it at like the top of niche side deck because you don't really have to play this. I would say like the Change of Heart cards are better because you can actually get some value off of the monsters that you steal most of the time, but still Kaijus are a pretty decent card, I think, and you should definitely consider them in your side deck if your deck struggles against those types of decks. Next up is Forbidden Droplet. So Droplet is in an interesting spot because Kashtira is gone. You would only ever be worried about facing Dimension Shifter and having this card be dead, but not too many decks can play Shifter. So then Forbidden Droplet, I think, can start floating back into the meta. It can be decent, I think, against the top decks out there for sure. Just being able to get tons of value by like activating a spell and then chaining Forbidden Droplet, sending that spell to the graveyard or something. If your deck can support a lot of that discard fodder that Forbidden Droplet forces you to have, then I think Forbidden Droplet can be a pretty solid choice. It does hit quite a few decks out there, and is one of the few cards where it says your opponent can't respond to it under certain circumstances. My only gripe with this card is that potentially against a deck like Unchained, I'm not too sure how high impact it would be against their end board, because they have ways around it of like, let's say, popping their own card and then reborning it back with Yama, and then by then you've already committed like 2 or 3 cards to the Forbidden Droplets, and then you're just down so many resources, whereas they can just reestablish part of their board. So I think for that reason, I'm going to put it in the niche side deck option. It can definitely have a lot of good matchups into a lot of the decks out there, but I think that it takes a specific deck to actually be able to play this because of the high cost. Next up is Triple Tactics Talents. So Triple Tactics Talents, I think, is good, of course, and it becomes a lot better if you're playing a card like Thrust. I don't know if I'd personally start maining 2 or 3 copies of this card, because I'm not really sure where this format's going to end up and whether or not hand traps are going to be super popular. So for that reason, I'm just going to keep it in like the strong side deck option for now. I think this card is definitely very solid in the main deck if you do play 3 copies of Triple Tactics Thrust, but I know not every deck is playing that, so the fact is, if you want to see this card consistently, you might have to start playing 2 or 3 copies of it. And once again, I don't know how good hand traps are going to be this format, so I'm just going to put it in the side deck option for now. I'm sure it'll still be a very good card that has a lot of applications even when going second, but for now, I'm not really sure I put it in my main deck just because of how unknown this format is at the moment. Next up is Infinite Impermanence and like effect negation hand traps like Effect Veiler and Ghost Mourner. Personally, I think they're pretty good because I'm sort of like a fan of hand traps. I don't like losing to decks just because you didn't have a single hand trap to stop them and just board breakers not being able to work against them. But I think that this format Impermanence is not in the greatest of spots. It's very mid against Unchained because you would have to not only hold the Impermanence for your turn pretty much, but also cards like Veiler and Ghost Mourners just don't do anything against Unchained. In general, effect negation is pretty much always a -1. Leaving your opponent with the body on board can be very problematic, and I think that reduces the effectiveness of these effect negation cards. I'm going to put this in like the top of niche side deck option. I don't know if I would go ahead and like main deck effect negation hand traps at least this format. I could be wrong about this, but in my mind, the way the format's playing out, I'm not so sure I would want to have effect negation in my main deck unless I have a lot of room for non-engine cards. Next up is Super Polymerization. I think this card is probably the definition of niche side deck option. There's always going to be decks it's super insane against. So for example, you could play it against Unchained and I'm sure it'd be really good, but at the same time, like, what is it going to do against like Pearly when going second and they have a Towers or something like that? So cards like this are very hit or miss, I think, and really depend on a specific matchup for them to be good. But also at the same time, it really depends on what deck you're playing and whether or not you have the resources to support the extra deck targets in your extra deck. So if you're playing a deck like Branded Despia or Chimera, then sure, I'm sure you have a lot of room to play it. But what happens if you're playing a deck like Pearly? Like, are you able to play this card or not? Because your extra deck may or may not be tight enough. So I think I'm going to put this in the niche side deck option. Definitely very high impact in the matchups where it's good against, but has the potential just to be dead in other matchups, and you do have to have a lot of extra deck room to be able to support a big package. Next up is Kurikara Divine Carnate, and Kurikara is in an interesting spot this format because of the loss of Kashtira Rysart. That was one of the biggest things you could Kurikara away. Like, they go Shangan, standby, summon, you activate a card, Kashtira Rysart sucks it up, and then you Kurikara away their board, and that was just insane. But now there aren't like too many decks off the top of my head that actually lose to this card, aside from potentially Pearly. But Pearly has a lot better ways of playing around Kurikara if they so choose to, whereas Cash didn't really have a choice because a Rysart was mandatory. So I think that Kurikara, this format, has gotten quite a bit worse. It can still be good into some combo matchups where you can force some stuff out, drop this, and then it can be pretty good at like taking something in end phase or applying a lot of offensive pressure that way. But I don't know if I would consider siding this format because of the loss of Kashtira. You could argue it's for Pearly, it's out to X-Pearly Nora, but at that point, I would just rather have a card like Kaiju because your opponent can't play around that, whereas your opponent can actually play around Kurikara if they're actually consciously thinking about it. I'm going to put this at the very bottom of niche side deck option. Perhaps this format, there are just not that many applications of this card that you can actually use. Next up is Book of Eclipse / Book of Moon. So Book of Eclipse and Book of Moon like sort of got worse in the sense that like Cash isn't a deck anymore. That was one of the best decks to use it against. Now it's particularly good against Pearly. It's okay against the Unchained deck. It's okay into some of the other decks out there. Like, you can argue it's like fine into something like Rescue Ace, like something like Eclipse, but then you start getting to matchups like Labyrinth, and then you're thinking like, oh, why am I playing this card in my deck? I don't think these cards are bad by any stretch of the imagination. I do think these are very good cards still, just because of how strong they are when going first. They're very good defensive cards that still hurts a lot of the decks out there. Even something like Unchained might be able to fold to something like this when you're going first. But then for that reason, since it's not as good as it was last format when going second, I'm going to just put this at the bottom of a strong side deck option. I do think you should still be playing books just to respect decks like Pearly and other decks that would lose to it. But I don't think you have to necessarily main deck the books anymore unless your local area has a lot of the decks that loses. And then next up is evenly matched. So evenly matched, this format I think can be pretty solid. It really just depends on how good it is against Unchained, I feel like. Unchained does have ways to be evenly matched, and I've seen like videos where people say, oh, it's very mid against Unchained. Other times it's like it's pretty solid against Unchained. But I think at the end of the day, it really depends on the board that they're going for, and depends on whether you have other cards to pair with the evenly matched. Aside from Unchained though, I think evenly matched does hit quite a few of the top decks out there. Not a lot of decks are ending with Omni Negates anymore, and I think that just having evenly matched to clear out big parts of their board can be good. Problem with evenly matched is that it conflicts with cards like the Bestials, Phantasme. If you start playing those, your opponent gives you Ibli, then these cards start becoming very weak. But I would still say it's a very strong side deck option. I do like it because it does have quite a large coverage in this meta, I think, and even if it isn't always going to work because of the cards like I mentioned before, I think that just having access to this card in your side deck just means you'll have a wide variety of coverage into a lot of the top decks out there, which is really important. Next up is Crossout Designator. So Crossout Designator is in an interesting spot. I personally played this card at YCS Vancouver, and from my experience, it was okay. But I know that Crossout Designator is a very hit or miss card, just because you have to be playing those tech cards yourself, but also at the same time, you don't necessarily know what tech cards your opponents are going to be playing. I think in this sort of like more open format, Crossout gets a lot worse. But if your deck very specifically loses to one or two single cards like Dimensional Barrier, Ash Blossom as like a branded player, then yeah, I can definitely see Crossout Designator being warranted to be played. I don't think you should main deck this card, at least not at the start of the format. Just wait until like the format's sort of established itself, and then people are starting to commonly play like certain tech cards. But until then, I think it's a pretty okay niche side deck option. It really depends on the deck you're playing. It's very good in certain decks, but I think that not every deck, of course, needs to play this. Next up is Anti-Spell Fragrance. I don't think there's too much to say about this card. It's a very strong side deck option when going first. Pretty much every single deck out there plays spells. Like even a deck like Unchained might just lose to a card like Anti-Spell just because of how strong it is. So I think that having Anti-Spell on your side here just means you have coverage for pretty much every single matchup out there in the meta, aside from like maybe Labyrinth. But every single deck plays spells essentially, and a lot of decks rely on those spells as like starters or power cards. So just being able to shut those off is really good. So yeah, Anti-Spell, definitely a very strong side deck option. I think that if you're choosing the side cards for going first, Anti-Spell is one of the strongest ones out there. Next up is Cosmic Cyclone. So Cosmic Cyclone as back row removal is solid because it's quick play, meaning it beats cards like Anti-Spell, doesn't trigger stuff in the graveyard, which is nice, and it works very well against like the Unchained back row. But I think my problem with Cosmic Cyclone is that it's difficult for it to get value when going second unless you're banishing like a Floodgate like Anti-Spell. So for example, if you're setting this into Unchained when going second, sure, you can get rid of one of their traps, let's say their Escape of the Unchained, and you trade 1 for 1 at the end of the day, but at that point, they still have a full board that you need to deal with. On the other hand, however, going first, this can be very good into a lot of decks, like very good into the Unchained deck when going first, very good into Pearly when going first, pretty solid into a lot of other decks as well that rely on like field spells. So I think that this is a pretty good card still. I'm hesitant to put it in the strong side deck option just because of the fact that it isn't necessarily the most high impact card out there. You can play cards like Harpy's Feather Duster, which are arguably more higher impact, as you won't always just go 1 for 1. But I do think that Cosmic Cyclone has a spot in a lot of side decks this format, and I think that it's definitely still a pretty strong option that you can consider playing. Next up is Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. So Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, I don't really like this card that much. I'm not too sure what decks it can really hit. You can argue it hits like Branded and Labyrinth, but those decks are not necessarily going to be the most popular decks out there. It doesn't really do anything against like the top decks like Unchained and Pearly. And I think for that reason, unless your matchup against like Labyrinth Branded is particularly bad, that, I'm not so sure I'd actually end up playing these cards. I want to say like this is like at the top of not good and the bottom of very niche. Good against a very select few decks, but I'm not so sure that it's actually worth side decking at all unless your local area has a lot of those decks. There are just like better cards out there against like those decks. For example, like I would argue if you're playing the Bystials anyways, then you could hit Labyrinth and Branded regardless, and you don't need to play a card like Bell in that case. Next up is Triple Tactics Thrust. Triple Tactics Thrust is insanely good because of the versatility that it has. Could have going first cards like consistency cards, going second cards like Talents or Change of Heart. And it's just so flexible because you don't have to play multiple copies of those other cards out there, and you can just play 3 copies of Thrust to sort of fulfill that role. I think that Thrust is insanely good this format also because of a deck like Unchained. You're able to essentially use it as like an engine piece in Unchained as well, which is crazy to think about. One small caveat about Thrust though is now that Cashier is out of the format, your opponents technically can choose to play around Thrust with all the top decks out there. You don't necessarily have to play into it like Cash was forced to when you activated a card and they had a Rise Heart. But nonetheless, I still think it's a very strong main deck option if your deck can support it. I would put it at like the bottom a strong main deck option and maybe like the top a strong side deck option. But I do think if your deck can support Thrust, you should probably be playing it just because of how powerful it is and the versatility that it has. Next up are the Bystial monsters. So Bystial Jerusalem in particular is said to be very good against the Unchained deck. I do think it's very good because it can crash a Griffin, it can send their monster. Your opponent will struggle to out it a lot of the times unless they go out of their way to do so. And I think that just hitting the Yama out of the grave can be very good. Not only that, it does have some applications against the other top decks as well. Like I mentioned, Branded, Labyrinth, if Tier becomes popular, that's a thing as well. Lots of light and dark decks out there in the meta, and I think that it's definitely worth siding the Bystials. I would say these are very solid side deck options that you should be playing if your deck can support it. Just because, once again, Jerusalem is a very annoying card to out, even for decks that aren't Unchained. Like, you do have to try to go out of your way to actually out it without sending it to the graveyard. Otherwise, you're going to be forced to deal with a send of one of your monsters. Next up is Droll and Lockbird. So this is an interesting one because it was said to be very good in like early last format. A lot of people were like main decking it, but now it's very up in the air. I don't think it's a very good card this format because of how it doesn't really hit Unchained. I know some people like it against Pearly. I personally hate this card against Pearly. I don't think it's very good against them. It also doesn't really do too much to a lot of the top decks out there. So I think like Rescue Ace, Branded, Labyrinth, like maybe it does something against Chimera. But aside from that, like I don't really know how many of the top decks it's really hitting out there. So I just have to put this card in like a niche side deck option. Yeah, it's still super high impact against like the combo decks like Infernoble and Manadium, but if those decks just aren't that common, then I'm not really sure that you should really be playing this card at all. Next up is Phantasme. Phantasme is an interesting one. I have seen people side it against like Unchained because it can help you draw into those non-engine cards, but also at the same time, the Unchained deck is a link deck. They do love to link summon, and dropping this on them can be solid because it does also protect your board from their targeting interruptions. I personally have never tested it against Unchained, so I can't really say how good it is, but at least in theory, I can see why it would be good against Unchained. It does have applications against some of the other top decks as well. You're able to hit like the Dragon Link deck if that becomes popular. But I think the problem with this card is not every deck is going to be link summoning that much. And even the decks that link summon like one monster, is it really worth it at that point just to side Phantasme for that one monster? You got to consider whether or not like the body it gives you and like the draw it gives you is really worth taking the slot of a non-engine card. Whereas on the other hand, if you're playing something like Dragon Link, yeah, it's a pretty solid choice because it's a dragon monster. It actually has synergy with your deck. But outside of that, I think that Phantasme is probably just going to be a very niche side deck option like Droll. It's very good into certain matchups, but also at the end of the day, it's not an interruption. It's not like back in the day. Phantasme can be good in certain decks, just not every single one out there. Next up is Kashtira Fenrir as an actual non-engine card, so just playing 3 Fenrir. I think this card is still definitely very good. It has a lot of applications. It's just generic and could be splashed into pretty much everything. No matter what deck your opponent's playing, there's always going to be something you can hit with the Fenrir just because of how flexible it is. It replaces itself as a free body. Just a lot of benefits to this card. The only thing is, I'm not sure like it's enough a lot of the times to break boards. Like against the Griffin board, for example, if you summon Fenrir, that's not really doing much. Against Expertly Noir, if you summon Fenrir, is not doing much. I'm not sure Fenrir will be played as an actual like non-engine card in a lot of the decks out there. So I'm gonna put it in like the niche side deck option. I definitely do think some decks can make good use of it. So like for example, if you can get extra value out of it, like in a deck like Vanadium or Vanquish Soul, definitely I'd say it's a very solid card. But if you're just trying to play 3 Fenrir and you can't really do anything else with it, I'm not so sure it's worth it. Next up is Lightning Storm. So Lightning Storm is similar to Harpy's Feather Duster, but it does have the additional option of being able to act as a Raigeki for all your opponent's attack position monsters. I think that flexibility is very nice, meaning you have the option to start putting it against like mid-range decks and some combo decks that don't end on interruptions. At the same time, there is the downside of you have to control no face-up cards, so it's going to be dead later on in the game most often. I do think it's a very good card though, and it does hit a lot of the matchups out there. You can just mass clear back row, which can be good for hitting cards like Floodgates, for example. You can mass clear the front row, so it can be good at hitting like mid-range decks. I do think it's a very good card. I would put it at like the bottom of strong side deck option. I think that you can play this if you don't have room for, let's say, too many spell and trap removal cards, like maybe like 1 Duster, 2 Lightning Storm, for example. That should be still sufficient because these are very high impact cards against like back row decks, assuming they don't have cards like Lord of the Heavenly Prison. Next up is Marionette Might. This card is very interesting because you would only really play it if you expect to see a lot of Unchained at the place you're playing. So out of YCS, of course, if everyone agrees Unchained is the best deck, I would say siding this card is fine because you're just targeting the best deck out there. The problem with this card is that it only targets the best deck out there. Like, you're only using it against the Unchained deck, and at that point, like, what happens if you don't run into Unchained? You're essentially playing a 12 card side deck. So I think that unless you know for sure you're going to be running into a bunch of Unchained, this is probably just going to be a very niche side deck option. Like, it's solid, it's very good into the Unchained matchup, but pretty much only usable in the Unchained matchup. So I think that if you're trying to be as safe as possible, you'd play more flexible cards in your side deck. Next up is Dimensional Barrier. So Dimensional Barrier is still in a similar spot as it was last format. Still a very strong card against the decks that it's good against. So against like Pearly, against the fusion strategies, it's very good. It can completely shut off some synchro strategies as well. There's just not too much to say about this because of how little counterplay it has. It's definitely a solid, strong side deck option. Once again, like Anti-Spell, if you're choosing to play cards when going first, Dimensional Barrier can be one of those great cards, and it has the added benefit of being able to be thrustable. So if you do play Triple Tactics Thrust, you can thrust out the copy of one copy of Dimensional Barrier in your deck, and that can be incredibly strong. Next up are Floodgates. Like there can be only one, Goes to Match, Rivalry. These are always format dependent. For example, against Unchained, you could play There Can Be Only One, but once again, not every deck can play it. Whereas on the other hand, if you're playing against like a fusion deck, like maybe you want like Rivalry or Gozen, but then once again, like you don't know like which one of these you're going to run into, and again, not every deck can support these cards. So I'm gonna have to put these like at the top of niche side deck option. These are very high impact Floodgates in the right deck. So for example, if you're playing a deck like Vanquish Soul and you play There Can Be Only One, that's incredibly strong because it does hit like the best decks of the format. But then again, like what happens if you're playing like Pearly? Like, you can't really play any of these Floodgates. So I think it's going to really depend on your deck choice and also really depend which one of these you can play. I think all of them are on a similar power level. They can completely shut out certain decks, but once again, not every deck can play them. Finally, I'm going to talk about Nibiru. So I mentioned a lot in my tier list video for the best decks that Nibiru I thought was going to be a lot more popular because generally Nibiru punishes the average to less than average Unchained players, and that's very important. It does have applications against some of the top decks as well. So for example, like the Cybers decks, they can be pretty good against. It's good against like Rika, for example. It's a very high impact hand trap in certain matchups. But then at the same time, it can be very hit or miss. Your opponent can sometimes play around it, or in some matchups, it's just not going to do a lot of things a lot of the time. So at the end of the day, I think that Nibiru is a very strong side deck option still, just because it does hit a lot of the top decks out there. But I'll put it near the bottom of strong side deck and the top of niche side deck. I don't know if you would want to main deck a card like this, just because it's a bit risky. You don't really know what you're going to run into and whether or not these are actually going to be good. But I do think that Nibiru does have quite a bit of potential this format, and it's definitely a hand trap that you need to watch out for. So with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Whether you agree or disagree with certain things, whether you think I missed something important, do let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.